Welcome to another episode of the podcast. Thanks for tuning in. It's great to have you here. I'm excited to welcome back to the show guest Cameron Josse. He is a strength and conditioning coach for football at Auburn University. He has experience in both the collegiate and private sectors and has worked with a wide variety of athletes. Cameron has an expansive knowledge of athletic performance and also a practical approach to implementation. I've learned so much from Cameron in his previous appearances on the show, and today's podcast was certainly no exception. He'll be covering resisted sprint training protocols and how he has advanced and some of the observations that he is getting from his athlete populations, from the linemen, the linebackers, and the skill players. Some of the key differences there. We'll be getting into strength training, sprint biomechanics, injury prevention, and more. It was fantastic having Cameron back on the show. Before we get started, I wanted to highlight our show's sponsors. The first is Team Builder, and if you're a coach looking for an incredible training portal for your athletes, either online or in person, then you can get a free 30-day trial of the Team Builder software by heading to teambuilder.com and using the code JUSTFLY. Our second sponsor is Lila Exogen wearable resistance gear. Exogen is a quantum leap forward in training because it can overload the angular and rotational aspects of athletic movement and do in a fine-tuned manner. Elite coaches are using this. So many Olympic athletes for the upcoming 2024 games are taking advantage, even in swimming. And you can get a 25% discount for a limited time by heading to lilateam.com. That's Lila team.com and using the code JUSTFLY25 for 25% off. Our last sponsor is the Plyomat. The Plyomat is not only my favorite jump testing device, it's also one of my favorite jump training devices because it gives you not just one mat, but you can link multiple mats together. You can do depth jumps, bounding, hurdle hops, and get reactive strength as a motivational tool, as well as modulating that plyometric experience. I absolutely love using it, and I know you will too. To check out the Plyomat, head to plyomat.net. That's plyomat.net. All right, on to the show here with Cameron Josse. Cameron, it's awesome to have you back on the show. I know we've had some great conversations about resisted sprinting, single leg to double leg, all sorts of topics. And it's been a little while since we chatted last. I'd love to hear about how some of your programming in resisted sprinting specifically, I know with all the technology coming out, everything with that. Where's that gone? How has that advanced since we last had that conversation?
Yeah, it's really good to be back, Joel. I appreciate you having me on. It's always a good time. And yeah, I'm excited about today because I think we're going to talk about some things that admittedly I'm branching outside my comfort zone with some of the questions I'm starting to ask myself with a lot of this stuff. But I guess that's science, right? I mean, that's where we need to go is we need to branch outside of where we're comfortable, be comfortable being uncomfortable, and then just go discover some things and see what we find. And so for me, with the resisted sprinting and everything, it's all part of my PhD work. And so I'm getting my PhD from a school in France, Jean Monnet University, where my primary supervisor is JB Marin. So I'm blessed to have that opportunity. When it came up, I had to jump on top of it. My co-supervisor is Dr. Ken Clark, which is all of it together. It's unbelievable. And I can't count my blessings enough that I'm in this program. But my goal with the whole PhD work is just finding out answers to practical coaching and how can practitioners become more efficient in what they're doing when they're programming aspects of sprint training, which includes resisted sprint training. And so for me, I'm just trying to figure out specifically in the sport of American football, what helps to push sprint performance in the right direction. And so resisted sprinting is a big part of that because these guys obviously have to deal with a lot of different forms of resistance in the game itself. And so having good horizontal strength and horizontal power capabilities they're up there, right? And it's so when I think about resisted sprinting, the goal as a whole is really just to improve horizontal power. So the product of my horizontal force and the product of my external velocity in the horizontal direction, how do I maximize those to where I can get the biggest product, the most power, right? And so everything is about maximizing horizontal power. And so when we think about a lot of the current research that JB's done and his team versus some of the literature from the past in track and field, perhaps, we almost have two different biases where there's two different ways to look at power, right? I mean, you're going to either increase it from a force standpoint and velocity might stay the same. You're going to increase the velocity side. Force is going to stay the same. You're going to try to achieve some aspect of both rising together. But everybody always talks about, you want the curve to be higher and you want it to be shifted more to the right? Like, I mean, it's just keep finding ways to maximize the total product of force and velocity. And so for me, when it comes to resisted sprinting, we can have a force bias in the way that we approach it, or we can have a velocity bias in the way that we approach it. And so really, if I'm talking about a force bias, the easiest way I think about it is a lot of the stuff that JB's done with Matt Cross and Pierre Samazino, and where they're talking about using heavier loads than traditionally utilized let's say it's any form of resisted sprinting. So it could be a sled, could be a 1080 sprint, could be an extra genie, so whatever it is, right? But just going heavier than what we've seen in the past. And there's so many podcasts about this, and I've written articles about it. There's so much about it, right? So, but basically the mindset is we keep the velocity constant and we add higher and higher loads to that velocity. So the famous number is the 50% decrement in velocity, or 50% VDEC, which is basically, if I take my theoretical maximum speed and I cut that in half, right, that's 50% of my velocity. And that's approximately the speed at which I will produce the most horizontal external power when it comes to sprinting. And so when we think about it from a training standpoint, if I run 10 meters per second, which is about 22 miles per hour for using imperial metrics, right, I basically find a load where, let's say I'm running 10 meters or 10 yards, and I want to reach and hold 50% of that speed. So if it's 10 meters per second, I'm trying to load myself until I'm at 5 meters per second. Or if 22 miles per hour, it's going to be 11 miles per hour. I'm trying to use both systems here for all the listeners.
Yeah.
And it could be, it's arbitrary on how much load is actually on the sled. And JB's talked about it, where it's less about percentage of body mass now that they're focusing on. It's more about actually if there's a way to measure the external velocity and you want to cut that down in half. But let's say 50% VDEC for me is 180 pounds on a sled, and I run that for 10 yards, and that's what I get is I reach 50%, right? And then after some time training, now all of a sudden I'm moving at 6 meters per second with 180 pounds. So I've become faster than my 50% velocity decrement. So what I would do is I would continue to add load to slow myself back down so I can keep training that horizontal max power, right? And so over the course of that time, let's say I move from 180 pounds to now I'm loading it at 200 pounds on the sled, and I'm moving at the same velocity, I can now infer that I'm getting more powerful through a force side of the equation, because the velocity stayed the same, but now I'm adding load to it. And so I'm adding power through load, adding power through force, right? And so on the flip side, we look at the velocity bias. And so let's say I have a 1080 sprint, and I want to set the load on the 1080 to 14 kilograms of resistance, right? And so what I would do is I would always keep that load at 14 kilos, but what I would do is aim for higher and higher velocities at that load. So now we're biasing the speed side of the equation. And so let's say I do a 15-yard sprint at 14 kilos, right? And the best speed I hit is 6.5 meters per second, which comes out to about 14.5 miles per hour if we're talking about imperial. And so then the next training session, I'm going to keep 14 kilos on there, but I'm going to try to get faster than 6.5 meters per second. And so we just keep aiming for higher and higher speed against the same load. Again, I'm still improving horizontal external power, but now it's just I'm biasing the speed side or the velocity side of the equation, right? And so that's really where we opted to start going with some of our training here. One, because it's a little bit easier to just keep the weight the same and move it faster and faster, because our players here, when we emphasize the force side of it, and we were manipulating the loads to suit each individual across a team of 120 individuals, and you have maybe 40 guys in a speed session that are working out at the same time, they don't get it psychologically. They don't connect with it. Like they're saying, hey man, I just ran this. What did you run? Well, I got this load on here. You have that load. And they're like, what do you mean? Like it's all confusing to them, right? Where if everybody's got the same load, like everybody's like, we're blessed here that we have 5 1080 sprint machines that we get to use for training. And I get it. Not everybody's got access to that, but just for the sake of example, right? We got five 1080 sprint machines, and guys are lining up on these machines and they're running. Everybody's doing the same distance against the same load. Let's say it's 15 yards, 14 kilos. Now, after every sprint on the tablet, I can tell them the speed that they hit, the top speed that they got over that 15. And so if this guy got 15 miles per hour and that guy over there got 15.3 miles per hour, that guy can brag that he's faster. They get it. I mean, it's a level playing field. And so we opted to go more that route this past offseason, and it was a lot more buy-in, a lot more intent out of the guys that we saw. But I think that there's just two different ways to go about it. And I think additionally, you have to think about what's important for that person as an individual and the position that they play. And so when I work in American football and I'm doing my PhD research, I'll break up the player positions into basically three broad groups. And so in my research and what I'm doing right now is I'll have a skill group, which is comprised of the wide receivers, the defensive backs, and the running backs. And the reason I put the running backs in there, because some people will categorize them as more of like a combination or big skill type position. I put them in there because of stature and speed capability was more in line with being similar to the wide receivers and the defensive backs than it is some of the linebackers or the tight ends or things like that. So their running demands in the game are much more similar to a bigger skilled position, but their speed capabilities in the context of speed research, I categorize them as being skill. And so the next group would be the big skill, which is your quarterbacks, your tight ends, your inside linebackers. And I also put the outside linebackers in there as well. So they're kind of a hybrid linebacker or down lineman, but because of what they're asked to do in the game and the speed requirements that they have, I categorize them in the big skill group. And then lastly, you have your linemen, which is just your biggest guys, your offensive linemen, and then your down linemen on the defensive line as well. And so what was interesting for me in my PhD research is I started this first paper that we're trying to put out is basically just it's a full descriptive paper of American football and speed. So what are we looking at in terms of split times across positions? What are we looking at in terms of force velocity profiling? So a lot of JB's work is going into this. And then what is the relationship between the split times, the force velocity metrics, and then the joint kinematics, in conjunction with the spatiotemporal variables like ground contact time, flight time, all of that stuff. So we're looking at everything. We're looking at it from a kinetic standpoint and a kinematic standpoint. And so when I think about horizontal force and what resisted sprinting aims to achieve is achieving more of that. The big metric from JB's work is the F0 or the F naught, right? Your theoretical maximum horizontal force capability as measured by newtons per kilogram. So in this case, we're thinking normalized maximum horizontal force. So how much force do I put out per unit of body mass that I have? And so when we looked across the entire team, F0, and I don't want to give specific correlational coefficient numbers yet because we still want to review it and make sure everything's correct and we publish it. So I'll just use broad terms like it had a large, significant negative relationship with the 5, the 10, and the 20 meter time. So we look across the whole team, we're like, all right, great. Like the higher the F0, the faster my sprint time, basically, from looking at these correlation coefficients, right? But what was interesting is then when we started breaking it down by position group. So instead of looking at it from the whole team, we broke it down by skill, big skill, and lineman. And what we found is that the big skill and the lineman groups, they have a large to very large significant correlation between your F0 and your split times, right? But then the skill group all of a sudden only showed more of a small to moderate relationship. It wasn't as important for them, right? And so that became interesting to me and we wanted to dive into it a little bit more. Right. And so when we looked at the P max, so like my maximum power, like we talked about before, the product of this force and this velocity, for every position, there was a very large to almost perfect negative correlation with P max and with any of the split times. So but like the 10 and the 20 meter times, it's very large to almost perfect relationship. So the higher my P max, the lower my sprint time is, or the faster my sprint time is. So great, we know horizontal power is important, right? It's obvious. But in terms of how we achieve that by position, it becomes different in terms of the importance of where we want to stress the training. So when we looked at the big skill and the bigs, we saw that huge, large to very large significant correlation with F0. Didn't really see it with the skill guys. Vice versa now, when we looked at the V0 on the other side of the equation, the skill group at shorter distances, like 5 to 10 meters, they showed a large, significant negative correlation with the V0 in their shorter distances, where the big skill and the lineman, it was more moderate. It wasn't really anything crazy to write home about. And so at shorter distances, it's like the players that are of lighter body weight, so we'll just say less than 220 pounds, because we could have some bigger skill guys in American football that are like 215 pounds. But for this group, if you're less than 220 pounds, it seems like chasing endless amounts of F0 past a certain point it's almost like strength in the weight room. It's like you're not going to get a ton of return on it if you just keep chasing it forever and ever and ever. It seems like there's a certain point where enough is enough, right? Because there's a lot of research on like if you don't have enough, you could be at risk for hamstring strain. And like JB's team's looking into that as well. Jordan Mendeguccia, some of all that. So obviously, to a certain extent, you got to get your F0 to a suitable level. But for these skill positions, it seems like after that, it's all velocity. In order, like, just keep getting the velocity up to make the P max go up. Keep rising the V0, right? But it's different when you have larger body mass. And I think it's because when you think of F0, it's mass specific force. And so it makes sense intuitively, right? If I'm a bigger guy, I'm going to need more mass specific force to move that big body. So I just need to build the engine a little bit bigger, have a little more power behind me, a little more force to move my big body, right? And so, like I say, it's obvious that when we think about it and we look at it, it's like, yeah, it makes sense. But at the same time, I think we're with some of the skill guys, and I think this is the argument from track and field, where they're not a huge fan of just constantly doing heavy sled work all the time, is because they're like, at some point you got to be fast. And I agree, and it seems to be showing this, right, and what we're looking at. And so I'm excited to get all this like put out there and published and all of that. But from the early findings, what we're seeing is that obviously everything needs to be individualized, but we also have to think about, in general, the way that we're training has got to be suitable for that position group, right? And so it's just more proof in the pudding that skill guys should not train like linemen, and big skill guys are somewhere in between, right? And so it's super fascinating stuff. But I just think, yeah, when it comes to the resisted sprinting and all of that, it's good to have a wide spectrum of training. But it's like, where are we spending most of our time? What are we chasing? If it's a younger athlete, maybe, yeah, we need to develop some horizontal force the same way we would vertical force in the weight room. But as they get better and better and better past a certain point, it's like everything's speed, everything is power, everything is explosiveness. So it's pretty interesting stuff.
Yeah, man, that was awesome. I took like a whole page of notes off that first, 12, 13 minutes. And so I'm like, all right, well, where do I start with this? You gave me a lot of like balls in the air to juggle. And so I will start with, well, one, going back to one of the very first things you said, which was a standardized process when you have 40 guys. And it's like, all right, well, how specialized do we want to get? And that's always the thing too, just from a very, and we talked before we even pushed record, like having a generalist mentality. And if I learned, one of the many things I learned across my time working in NCAA, like Division I, larger groups in the weight room, having 40 kids, is that logistics rule. Or even watching how swim coaches with a bunch of kids would go through their practice with a generalist mindset is logistics rule, like athlete, like intent, buy-in, managing that just core of the athlete engine. It is more important than, and like having all these individualized little buckets. And it's like you can get better at one thing, but you're going to pay for it somewhere else. And even what you said too with the F0, like you could get way better at F0, but you're going to pay for it probably, if you're a track sprinter, you're going to pay for it probably at 50, 60, 80 meters, your speed endurance. And so there's always that, the balance point, or like Rafe Kelly says, the Tao, like it's where does the balance meet? And so with that being said, because I love how that efficiency, like first, like, all right, we could, specialize a little bit, but hey, we're going to find something we could rank, record, publish, like what Tony Holler talks about in Feed the Cats, and that kind of mentality coming into it. But the other place I wanted to go, well, there's two other places. One, and I think we'll touch on this later, so we'll save it, but the idea of how strong is too strong. But it's just funny because if we get beyond even the weight room and something more specific, we can actually max that out with skill guys, right? So it almost gives you a new way of thinking for that. But I know we're going to talk about that later. So the thing that I did want to get to, and it's one of the later things you brought up, this is so fascinating, is that you can have too much F0, and that the V, could you remind me quickly before I keep going exactly what the V, I know for F0, it's mass specific force, horizontal force. What can you redefine V0 quickly, just so I can make sure I'm bringing my idea across correctly here?
Yeah, so obviously this is all, and I should have defined this as I was talking before, but I was going on and on.
Yeah, it's okay. No, it's wonderful. No, it's totally fine.
Yeah, you're right. So if we have our theoretical force velocity relationship, right, which is basically this linear relationship that's extrapolated from actual data, but it's if it was to keep going theoretically. So my F0 is, in theory, if I had zero velocity, what's the most horizontal force I would have? And then V0 is basically the opposite of that. What would be my theoretical maximum velocity at basically zero force, right? So it's always going to be a number that is slightly higher than your actual max velocity capability. And then the P max is your theoretical, just the curve and the relationship there. That would be the product of those two, the theoretical maximum of that. And so, yeah, basically, if you just think about, so in the PhD research, when I compare statistically anything against V0, it's basically the exact same trend that it would be if I compared it to the actual V max. It's just like the number itself is going to be higher because it's theoretical maximum. It's not your true maximum. But anything that it's basically just velocity, max velocity, because anything that relates to true max velocity, it shows the exact same trends in the data. So that's the easiest way to think about it.
Cool. Yeah, that's kind of what I thought, but I didn't have an actual definition. I'm more familiar with that, the force velocity piece with the F0 and the P factors, but it definitely makes sense. And so where I wanted to go with that, there was a few things that kind of wires or that I connected with some previous episodes. One was Cal Dietz had said something about this, that even just in the weight room, weights, that the skill guys or more skill type, like people who had more of a profile similar to skill positions, they did better under 80%. Like if we're talking 50 to 80% move quickly type stuff, elastic, even though I'm sure there's some of those athletes who are more of a wide ISA as well, but they generally did better with those speedier weights, whereas the throwers, the bigs, they tended to do better over 80. So it's almost like a mirror, it's like, what do you call it? Like a hologram, quantum hologram, like what is true somewhere is also true somewhere else in the network. And I just thought that was interesting. But what I was really, it was actually something that Dan Bach, Jump Science, he had just put something out about this the other day, was that he was like a basketball player who did track a year. And Dan had worked with this guy, I think, for several years. So he had his stats. He had his like acceleration stats and top end speed and all these things. And this athlete did track for the first season. And of course, typical high school track was just like a bunch of like longer sprints, like tempo, not complete recoveries, a lot of the stuff that you just kind of see on the high school level. But this athlete came back to Dan and not only was running faster, like top end, his acceleration actually had gotten better too. It through like the longer sprints. So you'd be like, oh, that's not specific, but it's kind of like what Tony Holler talks about, or just track coaches in general. A lot of times that fly 10, getting better at that, which the V0, you could say it's just V0, not, I mean, directly, there's skill stuff, but it's probably a lot closer, is that if that's your superpower too, you're an elastic, you're a skill guy, or your track, like that's kind of the superpower that can bring up the I don't call it the bottom because it's important, but it's just an interesting way of thinking about that. And I was also thinking too, like people who are familiar with like James Wild's quadrant, more air time, ground time. I like Pat Davidson's more air or more ground as well. I know Stuart McMillan's talked about that as well. Athletes who like to be in the air, athletes who like to be on the ground. And then you have the frequency on the other axis. And it would make sense too that the bigs are going to be more ground type people. They're not going to be like the just by nature, you can't be unless, I mean, there's various. Maybe Zion Williamson. I'd be curious, how he would stat someone like that, like outlier or LeBron James or something, but you would think too that just the nature of body weight and time on the ground would be very influential with your strategy over time and just your ability to generate, the air ground axis as well.
Yeah, well, something else that was like a little tidbit that's interesting, and I'm still looking into it more. And what we're finding is that the step velocity itself, like how fast the leg moves through the push phase, is really, really important for the bigs. It seems like there's a big correlation to performance for those guys, but it doesn't seem to be as big of an important factor for the skill guys. And I think it's because skill guys can compensate so much more. So you're talking about the James Wild quadrant and all of that. Like that's exactly where skill guys can be all over that, where I think because the bigs are so big, they have less opportunity to compensate in it to a certain degree. Yeah. It's like, I got to get this big body moving. And like, we all kind of need to self-organize to do this better or else we're not going to move. So it's, if I can't just push my big body weight around while I'm on the ground, where a skill guy might bounce a little bit more than he pushes, or pushes a little bit more than he bounces, or, achieves it through contact distance, contact length, or all that, all of those different factors, they can compensate a little bit more because they have a little bit more room to play with there. Where I think with the bigs, you're seeing they don't have as much room to do that. And the big skill guys, your athletes that are over 225, to 275 pounds. Like they're somewhere in between, like some might be able to compensate. Others are going to be more like the bigs. And so it really is fascinating. And it's funny you said that about the weight room, about, like the skill guys really separate themselves with lighter weights. It's the same thing with the sprinting that we're finding. The same thing with the resisted sprinting is that when you're trying to chase more of that 50% VDEC, it can be misleading because some of your higher performing guys are actually pretty slow guys. You know what I mean? Like they might be fairly strong and decently powerful, but as soon as you go from like a 50% VDEC to a 20% VDEC, so now they're operating at 80% of their relative maximum speed, those fast guys are blowing everybody else out of the water. I'm talking by like miles per hour, plural, right? Like it's off charts different. And so it's pretty interesting how you're right. Like those who are more elastic, more reactive, faster in general, have better, more efficient nervous systems. Like the faster they're going to be asked to activate their musculature, the better they're going to be by far. They're really going to separate from everybody else.
Yeah. I would imagine too, like even looking at on-field performance, like, and thinking of it as options or optionality, I guess, if that's a word, like the more you get, and it's interesting to think too, well, how do you approach things for the bigs? In the sense of, if I'm someone who has a lot of options, I've thrived off elastic work and I love options, but is that what a true big needs, like in terms of their skill set and their development, and just keeping things efficient and then letting them be an athlete in their other work. And I do, it is interesting to think of, even I like Pat Davidson's, you're more air, more ground, and talking about more air, like a diver or a snowboarder is the ultimate more air. How many options do they have? How many options do they use? And it would be interesting too, to think about, like a more air person on that quadrant, almost they probably have the ability to run fast with a few different strategies, at least for the shorter distances. Once you get to full top end speed, your options start to limit themselves a little bit more. But because they need that. They need to be able to run fast in that mid zone with a lot of different torso alignments and step patterns, because that is their sport. And it's interesting to think about these cross links of things like that into athleticism, into what good athletes can do on the field. And then almost a reverse engineering is, how much does your work on the field and your whole roots of playing all these team sports and doing that on a regular basis impact what we're seeing? So, it is fascinating to me in that respect. I'll ask you just this is a little bit more of a general basic question, but you mentioned the 50% for everybody, but like, let's say you have those super skill guys, right? And would it be better for them to do less of that? Maybe they're doing it, but do they, crush the whole workout, or do they, all right, you got your 2 or 3, rank, record, publish it, but we want to get your superpower too. What do you think about that? I'm just curious with that piece of it.
Yeah. I mean, that's where my research is going.
Yeah.
Is to have a better understanding about that, because it is interesting that, when you looked at the whole group, the entire team as one unit, it's showing how F0 seems to be so largely important for sprint performance. If you're just looking at it against sprint times, we'll say like split time. But then when you break it down by position and how that changes the story, now it's like, okay, well, how much truly heavy stuff do the skill guys need? And so like that makes me think about it. Okay, if that's happening, like you said, from something that's so much more specific, which is a horizontal sprint type of scenario versus a weight room scenario, it's now, does that question then bleed into the weight room itself too? Is like, how heavy do we need to go and for how long? And so I think there's so much in track and field, through what I've seen just through my research, where there's not a ton of track and field minded people, specifically with sprinters, that are just constantly going heavy all the time.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like it's just, you don't see it. And I think in American football and other team sports, we've just sort of written that off as like, well, it's track and field, right? But it's funny because at the same time, we're still trying to develop a lot of the same qualities that these sprinters are really good at. High levels of elasticity and reactivity, a lot of velocity capability, and just a lot of speed strength in general. So just a lot of power. And so I think about it from the standpoint of, what are we most impressed with when we watch a skill guy in American football? Everybody's enamored with the 40-yard dash and like, how fast is this dude? Or when he's got the ball in his hands, can he just take the top off or make everybody look silly around him? And so all of those factors that we're enamored with are indicative of a very high functioning, efficient nervous system to me. Very elastic, very reactive. The perception action couplings are off the chart. Like just a lot of brain-based stuff,
Yeah.
right? So the way my brain activates my body, my nervous system activates my body, the way I perceive the environment, everything is quick, quick, quick. Whether it's speed of actual movement or speed of processing, we're enamored by all that stuff when we watch team sports, right? And like, I don't know how many people really care if they were going to watch a video of a cornerback doing like a 500-pound squat, or push or dragging this super heavy sled. I think it's the lay person and the viewers and even all of us who are in performance, like we're just kind of like, yeah, whatever. But we're so much more impressed by he just jumped out the gym, or he just exploded, or he made everybody look silly around him. And so to me, it's like, well, there's your sign, and all of this is obviously through the context of the skill players, because the story does change when you talk about a lineman. And so like we're more interested in a lineman just pile driving a guy into the ground. So we would be more impressed by watching. I like watching videos of you might have brought up Werner Gunther before, and like the way he can lift weights and so efficiently he can do that as a shot putter and then go do his jumps, and like it's super fascinating to watch those guys, like these big guys, do a combination of all these different things, and like just the bar bending on their back, and that's fun, right? But when you're talking about a skill guy, it's almost like people are like, yeah, whatever, like he lifts this, but I'm more impressed by all the other stuff he can do that's like very sport specific or very skill based, right? And so I think it's true. Like we need to, in my line of view, I think we need to listen more to some of the track minded people in terms of how to develop this and maximize the nervous system to be as reactive as possible, to be as high functioning, high firing, and rate coding and recruitment and activation and all of these things. Like there's a lot of lessons to be learned there, instead of just grinding these dudes. And you think about like the type of players we're recruiting now at the skill positions, they're long, they're lanky. Like the traditional track and field greyhound is now becoming the wide receivers that we want, the defensive backs that we want, right? And so it's interesting. I think we really need to rethink some of this stuff and hash it out and give ourselves an idea of the way we want to train these guys and what we're trying to get them better at. I think if we lose sight of the main thing, then we start chasing these endless rabbit holes of going maybe in the wrong direction, and I'm not trying to bash lifting or going heavy or anything like that. I just think it's all about understanding where things fit in context and why we're doing them. You know what I mean?
Yeah. The Anatoly Bondarchuk transfer of training charts, all that stuff, I think a lot of it came out of the 80s or 90s, or I'm not sure when he put those together. I think there's probably some other ones that were just general Soviet. Okay, if you're this track event, here's when your half squat correlates, here's when it stops, here's even the jumps, standing triple jump, whatever. And yeah, it'll be interesting to see. I think especially because I was just thinking with stuff like, F0, velocity, and some of these other markers that are more specific. If we have the pyramid of training, we have the strength stuff that is, I think, SPE at best, as Keir Wenham-Flatt says. And then you get things that are closer to the special developmental, higher on the transfer piece. Like I would assume F0 is a higher transfer piece to what you ultimately see in sport than what you lift in the gym, especially for skill people. But even then, like you were saying, it's even higher up. It's into the V0s. And so to me, that is, it'll be interesting to see where those transference pieces go. But something you said, it really resonated with players who are just fast. And this almost goes beyond, and I think numbers and technology and being able to have tracking systems it gives us such valuable data. But I find it interesting in seeing youth sports, like kind of as you said, the perception piece. So much of being a good athlete is being able to perceive your environment, one, but then also shedding all the inhibitions. I was just listening to a Chris Korfist speech on like fly 10, like if your fly 10 peaked out. And a lot of Chris's stuff is almost like he had said, it's like ticking off the boxes or removing layers of fear from an athlete, basically removing all the inhibitors that are what's keeping you from this. And when I watch or I coach youth athletes, or even I see athletes in high school track and in high jump, for example, the athletes who have inhibitors, they have a lot more heel strikes on their approach, which is already slow by nature. It's not like it's not as fast as a sprint. I mean, relative to a sprint, a high jump approach is much slower. But the more heel strikes you see inhibitors. It might be a mental, it might be a fear threshold, and maybe it's a perceiving and being able to move with air, a more air person in your environment. But I've started to really take on the idea of along with the perceiving, and even like a play-based origin for all this stuff. The kids who become the athletes are those who perceive their environments well, and they don't have all the inhibitors. Because I have 3 children now, one of whom is too young to even know. She's 3 months, but my other kids are 5 and 7. And one of my children has a ton of inhibitors, and the other one doesn't have them so much. And it's so interesting to see how that difference starts already. And you think about how that will change. Even stuff like vision. One of my child who is more inhibited got glasses earlier. Like there's like information coming in the system, and you think about all that stuff. And to me, it's interesting, even looking at like a top down versus a bottom up. I think the top down is almost like the okay, here's your force value, here's your specs of your profile, and the bottom up is almost all like, well, what's your vision like? What's your perception? What's your proprioception like? Yeah, all that stuff. It's almost, you have the two sides of it. So yeah, to me, I mean, both sides are fascinating, but I think the further we go along, the more we can integrate some of these values and consider how the athlete got here. And I think that'll help us almost fill in those gaps of, well, we got this athlete fast, and there's still things on the field, right? And maybe our biggest impact, if we're a generalist, is some of the soft pieces of how we're perceiving reaction, visual stimuli. And those are things that I'm highly interested in. It would take a lifetime to get all these pieces, all these ways you could go top down and bottom up. There's so much there.
Yeah. I mean, it's fascinating because you think about the constraints-based model and just taking that sort of approach with it. And so Sean Mishka is a really good friend of mine, and he's been diving into it forever, right? And he's got these ideas that he's so passionate about. So when you talk to him, you can just tell he's so passionate about it, almost to a fault sometimes. He's almost like aggressive about it, right? And but he's trying to just put it out there about, we need to pay attention to this side of it. And it's like anybody else who realizes something is important to the piece of the puzzle, it's got to be recognized. And so it's just, to me, when it comes to the perception action coupling and all of that, like if we don't recognize that as being so important to sport, then we can easily mess that up. So, because that's all tied into your nervous system, like we talked about before. So my ability to perceive, my ability to react, my reflexive system, all of that is neural based. It's brain based, neural based. And so it's behaviorally based, right? And so when I think about everything as a behavior, like a manifestation or an expression of a behavior, whether it's just a motor movement or something I say, something I do, it's all behaviors, right? My body is doing something in life, in space, and all of that. And so it's fascinating when you start thinking about all these different layers. And I think that one of the more fascinating books I've ever read is Robert Sapolsky's Behave, and how he says you have a behavior that just took place. And he gives this whole overview of where the research stands in terms of what happened 1 second before that behavior occurred, which is at the level of the nervous system. You're talking about minutes to hours before that behavior occurred, days to weeks, months to years. And he takes it all the way back to how millennia ago, like cultural influences that all tie into the way that you behave and just what manifests in terms of your behavior. And so you talk about all of these inhibitors and all of that. And so a lot of the movements that we see in sport are behavioral movements. And so we have to understand behavior, not just at a psychological level, but how then that interplays with what I'm manifesting physically. And so if you think of it all from that standpoint, the common theme for me, it just keeps coming back to the nervous system, and because even when you talk about something like muscle hypertrophy, Andrew Huberman had a good podcast about just muscle development and muscle growth. And he even likened it to, it starts at the nervous system. How well does that, how well does the nervous system activate that fiber? What's the communication between the nerve and that muscle cell? And if that's off, then that muscle probably not going to grow very well. Even to the point where, like, can you just voluntarily flex your pecs really hard to the point where you feel like you're going to cramp? And if you can, then you're probably more inclined to have a big chest because you have better neural recruitment to that muscle group. It's just super fascinating where even like no matter what level of bias you take, whether I'm a muscle building guy, a powerlifting guy, a speed guy, a perception action coupling guy, it all comes back to the nervous system in the brain. The more I look at it and how that activates and helps dictate what the body does as a function. It's really fascinating.
Yeah. I like, one of the themes I'm on is it's just linking like the sport ecosystem with natural ecosystems. And then observing how animals are in so many ways the ultimate athletes. How do they operate in nature? I was just doing some writing in my front yard on the porch the other day. I'm watching this robin hop around, and it just like knows where the worms are. I'm like, how do you know where the worms are? You are the ultimate perceiving and reacting athlete. Like, it's like they I think science has it like maybe it's vibrations through the ground and their superior hearing. I mean, it's absolutely amazing, but they have it. Like when you have it and you're in your natural environment being a huge piece of it too, that shapes the ability to behave. And it's interesting to think. So it's almost like humans, as we grow layers of the brain on animals, and we have more of a stress retention. It's almost like there's more complexity and there's more places we can go wrong in some ways, as well as an increased disconnection from our natural environment. I mean, we are now indoor. It's in the last 100 years we went from being connected to that. You even think just bare feet on the ground and growing up, and if you're playing in the woods, it's like parkour every day, kind of, or whatever. And now it's not like that at all. And you think about how that's changed the feedback loops in so many ways. I don't want to go too far, off on that, because that's just something
that's its own podcast.
It is, and yeah, it's definitely its own podcast. But with all that too, and even the perception reaction, all these places you could go very far down. But speaking from where you're at, approaching things from a generalist lens, I did want to ask you, because this is interesting to me, outside of the things that are measured from force velocity profiling, things with metrics and numbers, because it is interesting. There are people out there who are, I guess you would say, anti-force velocity profiling, like, hey, just do the sprint technique first and then let the numbers take care of themselves, which I definitely understand that. So I guess what I'd ask in light of what we've spoken of so far would be running technique. If we're jumping on the technical piece a little bit, you mentioned all these different buckets of skill players. And of course, a running back is going to have different running kinematics than a wide receiver. I'm sure different kinetics as well, or the kinematics being the biomechanics and kinetics being force. I'm sure they're both different. But how do you go about, along with the, I guess, more the logistics general, this is how we're going to set training up to optimize a group. How and where do you deviate or look to correct athletes who might be falling outside the bandwidth of how to run in their sport? And back to the nature piece too, the last thing I'll say is I think about that robin, or you think about an animal like a cheetah hunting, like they have it and they're in their environment and they're going to run well, and for us humans where things might go wrong here and there, how do you determine when something's going wrong in context of how an athlete generally should run in their position?
Yeah, that's also part of my work, is trying to figure out where do we need to stress certain things and where can we let them fly, so to speak. And I'll basically just touch on one because it's the one that I feel most passionate about, and I have for a while, is really the biggest thing I look to actually intervene on is the anterior pelvic tilt, like the excessive anterior pelvic tilt, because I think that's putting these guys in such a risky position, whether it be the hamstring or possibly other soft tissues as well. But there's just so much that seems to be coming out now about excessive anterior pelvic tilt. So if I'm just getting gradually more and more hyperextended at the low back. So the best way to visualize this for a listener would be I'm running upright and my chest is pointed forward, but my hips are pointed towards the ground. Like I'm just this big sway back duck butt position, right? So that means anterior means my pelvis is shifting forward. So my hips are pointed to the ground rather than being more neutrally aligned with where my face is pointed, my chest is pointed, my torso and my pelvis, right? And so I started noticing it just from coaching, is like the guys who ran more like that had tighter hamstrings, or they would pull hamstrings, or they were just, something was always going on with their hamstring. And it's not everybody. There's some guys that could run like that and never have problems. But just generally speaking, there's a lot of just research out there that's starting to come out. A lot of it's from Jordan Mendeguccia and how he's very, very much involved in looking at this anterior pelvic tilt. And in his most recent paper, I don't know if it's his most recent paper, but it came out in 2024 about the anterior pelvic tilt, where they actually used cadaver studies and they tilted the pelvis and looked at how it stretched the biceps femoris. So the biceps femoris seems to be the most injured hamstring muscle, specifically proximally, so closer to the glute. It seems to be injured more there versus distally, more down by the knee. And so in his paper, he wrote how for every 5 degrees that my pelvis shifts forward, I'm actually stretching that biceps femoris 1 centimeter, which is almost like half an inch. Right. And so if I'm just like, if I've got 20 degrees of shift going forward, which is actually pretty common in a lot of team sport athletes, now I'm basically like overstretching that biceps femoris through the tendon and the muscle almost 2 inches more than it needs to be versus if it was just in a neutral position. Right. And so he's done some good research in terms of, can we actually change that? Can we intervene and make change in that? And so his paper where he did it with max speed running was super interesting because they were able to reduce it by about 5 degrees. I can't remember what the time frame was, but I just know that they did a myriad of different training protocols. So like it was manual therapy, because I think he's a physiotherapist by trade initially. And then so did some manual therapy, some soft tissue work. They did a lot of lumbo-pelvic control work. You're thinking about just, it could be ground-based, like your plank variations, your bird dog variations, some of the Stu McGill type exercises. But he's also doing some of these contextual exercises, like some stuff that you would see more from like Franz Bosch, but then also things like wickets and high speed running. And the whole time is just like emphasizing the position of the pelvis throughout all of these different movements, from slow, high force movements all the way up to just really high speed wickets or something like that. And so they showed, he was able to tilt it back almost posteriorly. He was able to tilt it back about 5 degrees in the study and what they found. So you're looking at like the more neutral we can get it, the less that hamstring is going to overstretch when you're approaching the ground. And so typically when I look at the athletes that sprint with that anterior pelvic tilt, is like their hips are pointed down, they heel strike, and then they basically leg curl the ground through. Yeah. And then they swing up and back behind their body over excessively. So they're almost like falling on their face with every step excessively, right? Like it's like if you were to trip somebody up in football and like the movement they start doing before, like a running back, before he actually falls to the ground, it's like they're running like that. You know what I mean? Where it's just this excessive backside swing, not a lot of front side lift. And when you look at it, they can't use their elasticity when they run like that, because they don't allow themselves to lift that knee to the front side of their body and come back and actually bounce through the combination of the proper sequence of recruitment from the hip, knee to ankle and through the foot, and get a nice bounce when they're at top speed or in the upright position. And so the hamstring ends up taking on so much more force than it really needs to. It doesn't get to share that with the other tissues surrounding it. So it doesn't get to properly co-contract with the quads or the calves, or, muscles of the shin or the soleus or any of this stuff, or the foot. And so it just takes on this brunt of stress that it just doesn't need to take on. And so more often than not, when I see guys running like that, I'm like, it's just a ticking time bomb. At some point, something's going to go, right? And so we need to just help him with that, get him to understand his pelvic position. And a lot of those guys have low back issues. Yeah. They're not utilizing their core properly. It's just this total lack of pelvic control. So to me, that's really the main one that I'm focusing on right now, because I know that that's important, both from my experience and just from what the research has started to show. Is like, that's one that, to me, I always say, like, if it's not super dangerous, maybe we leave it alone for now. But if it's something that's actually dangerous, like if I'm about to do a deadlift from the ground and I got a cat-like spine completely rounded over, like that's dangerous. I got to do something about that. Yeah. Right? The same thing when I see anterior pelvic tilt, I'm like, that's dangerous. Like, we need to start. It might not happen today, but it's going to happen at some point. Whether it's just a lot of tightness, because I used to run like that, and thankfully I never actually pulled or tore my hamstring. But man, my hamstrings would get so tight when I ran like that when I played college football. Like, just so much tightness and soreness in my hamstrings that just didn't need to be there. So that's the big one that I look to technique wise, for sure.
Yeah, it's interesting to think. One thought I had with that was, you mentioned the athletes who they have that anterior pelvic tilt, and then how they end up running, which heel strike, and it's like into an excessive backside, and that running by nature is more ground. If you think about more air and more ground, yes, it's more ground and it's less options. And so often I think too about, you might talk to, and I think we may have covered this when JB and Chris Brahma were on, but like athletes who, it's like, wow, all my markers say you should get hurt, but you haven't got hurt yet. Well, why haven't you got hurt yet? And I think sometimes, or one of the factors that might just simply be having options. Like an athlete who can generate enough options and whose nervous system is working at a good enough level, it's almost like you can option and athletic yourself out of that sometimes. But an athlete who's truly running like that, it's like the less options you have and the more stress you have, that's just like this ultimate recipe that's going to send you in a bad direction. But I like what you said about basically, I think you alluded to not like making a big deal of it, right? Because we also want to, being a generalist, not like nocebo athletes, like, well, let's line you up. You 8 are in high risk of hamstring injury. You wouldn't want to tell someone that, so it's almost like, you think, well, where do you start with that? And I, there's a book I've been reading. I'm, amongst like track coaching and working with youth sports, I'm going to be taking on like a little bit of like nature games for kids at a local like learning garden. And the kind of curriculum I'm working off of a book it's on like coyote teaching. It's based off like Native American like work. And the coyote was like the trickster, but it's almost like you trick people into doing the thing without actually telling them. Like if you want to get a child involved in nature, you just play hide and seek in the woods. And they're sitting there hiding, and they're like, "Oh, look at this cool leaf or bug or something, something like that." But it's like, well, how do you go about the anterior pelvic tilt without like when do you make a big deal of it? When is it just like, hey, let's maybe put some core special strength in you think bottom up, like all the underlying qualities. Maybe we could just fix those, and like, or even the top down. You wouldn't even have to say anything, like doing like the Franz Bosch stuff, some of the wicked stuff that's going to correct that overly ground piece. Do you have to say anything? I don't know. Like, how do you go about that? Can you extrapolate on that? Like, how do you present that to an athlete in light of not noceboing, or when do they need to be made aware of that?
So a big thing is just showing them. If you show them some videos of how good, efficient technical sprinters run, that does wonders. Especially at this level, being at Auburn, these guys are so athletic and they're so able to adapt so quickly. And so there is some times where we just got to talk about it. Like if I'm to go back to the deadlift example, if I'm in the weight room and the guy's about to round his back, there's no coyoteing telling him to you got to straighten that thing out, man. Like it's just because if you right now you look like this, you need to look like this, just it's one of those things where, if it's bad enough, I feel like that's where I got to step in and actually talk to the guy about it and explain to him what we're looking for. And then if that doesn't happen, like if it's not a true just motor control, like let me just figure this out kind of thing, and there's a true limitation that's there, that's the point at which we have to figure out how do we kind of trick his system into doing this better. And that's where I think it's fascinating what Jordan did in some of his papers about all the different avenues he took, because maybe it's a soft tissue manipulation issue. Like it's just got to be his soft tissue quality is terrible. We need to just improve that so that his body almost like, I don't want to use the word relax, but just kind of like neurally just figures itself out. And something's like just too inhibited or too activated, or manipulate that in such a way that now all of a sudden the pelvis is going to tilt in a better position or whatever. So how much of it is like something they think they need to do consciously and they're purposely doing that we can tell them like, hey, don't do that. Like the classic, like over super extended squat, looking up at the ceiling kind of thing. It's like, they think they need to do that potentially. Because there's some players that think like I have to lean forward at high speed to like go forward better. You know what I mean? I always think about like, you talk about the whole natural thing and how animals just kind of move. And I feel like the thing that really messed us up as humans is the invention of a finish line, because now we're leaning for something. We're like, if there was no finish line, we were just running in the meadows and the prairies. Like we'd probably run with great frontside lift and good bounce and all that stuff. But the fact that we think we have to chase something on the ground, and every athlete has seen a race, they all understand like we're going to this line. I think there's something about that makes them think they need to lean for the line, and it's just something that, you got to attack it from all different standpoints. Sometimes you got to tell them and just make it straightforward and bring it up. And other times, can I just create my training system to focus on lumbo-pelvic control, to focus on some of these contextual drills and doing them efficiently? And does the problem start to take care of itself as a result of that? Do I integrate soft tissue work in my program, mobility work in my program just organically? So now I take care of 80% of the team by doing that. And then the other 20%, we bring them in for maybe some extra work, or we talk it through with them. We show them some video, whatever needs to be done, So it's just many roads lead to Rome, or whatever the phrase is.
Yeah. One of the things actually I did want to ask you this, and you had mentioned Ken Clark was one of your advisors. I had a conversation with Ken about this a few months ago. And Ken will be on this show here in the near future. I'm sure we'll discuss this. And some of it revolved around that famous like treadmill, like where there's like the team sport player who's just going nuts with the foot high behind and things like that. And Ken had actually said, and as he mentions this in his presentations, is that guy was kind of an outlier relative to others. We pulled him very, very fast relative to his running speed, those types of things. But that guy was going nuts, and a lot of people are pretty familiar with that. But one thing I've noticed, and I noticed this, speaking of perception, I saw this very clearly with swimmers, is you get some people who are running, and like tennis was never this bad, or other sports, obviously track, fine. There is a skill to learning to run, like you mentioned, with no context, because we are wired for context. We're wired to have something to chase or to run from, or like Frank Frencich says, like in nature, there's not like, hey, cheetah, you're going to run for 120 meters and then you're going to be done. It's like, no, you're going to be done when you catch the thing, that you're wired to be in connection with your environment. And I saw this very clearly with swimmers who, if you look at if you had athletes 0 to 10 on perceptual and reactive ability, a lot of swimmers are going to be a little bit lower. I had some that were really good, but those were the athletes. Like I had one athlete who I want to say he fell on his face just doing a 10-meter sprint. Because in the fall, in the off season, we do like 10-meter sleds for time. And I think, and because like the guys team liked it, who doesn't like racing, we did some 10-meter sprints. And I tell you, man, I had some guys who actually blew me away with how fast they were. But I had a lot of, if you talk like over pushing, relying on being on the ground to get your sensory, like it was very heavy on that. But I had a guy who I think face planted, like backside into a face plant, because without the stimulus, they just didn't know how to do it. But then where I'm going with this is, well, that same person, like I've seen them playing basketball or, screwing around playing frisbee and stuff like that. If there's a stimulus, now it changes. Now the timing changes. Now they're not going to fall on their face playing soccer, because there's something to track, and it's not just, well, I guess I'm going to try to reference the ground as my stability point. You know what I'm saying? And I do think I feel like I have seen this where athletes who might be, let's just say, poor in a 40 or on a treadmill, when you put them in a game and their stimulus, at least from an organizational perspective, they get better. Now, if they have a bad pelvic tilt issue, that is certainly a kink in the system that they have to work around, and that could get bad. But I'm curious what you think about like just sprinting versus a task orientation and quality of running when there is tasks and in the game. And if you do look at those in tandem, or if there's just any comments or thoughts you have on that.
Yeah, I mean, you always have to understand everything in context, and so I think it's funny you talk about having a very specific task. I think it was Derek Hansen who had an article or a post at one point where he talked about how bank robbers don't seem to pull hamstrings,
Yeah.
They just so it is kind of interesting, but yeah, I think it's interesting because we have to look at what we do with such responsibility, and because we as physical preparation specialists are tasked with making sure that they are physically prepared to play the game. And so as a result of that, we have to try and do our best to remove as many physical constraints as we possibly can. And so a lot of people think about that as like, I got to get them stronger, faster, more powerful. I had a good conversation with Lauren Landau about this a while back, where he talked about how a lot of his mindset is just, let's remove physical constraints so that if they're physically less limited, now they can really just, they don't have to think about like, man, I'm slow. I can just be like, where do I line up? What's my job? What do I do? Let me go score. Right. But at the same time, I think there's something interesting. I think it was one of the Altus courses, maybe their Need for Speed course, where they talked about this whole obsession with Nordics and hamstrings and how, is there, it kind of ties into some of the stuff you talk about in your book, where if we're overemphasizing something to a certain point, like if somebody just hears do Nordics protect hamstrings and they start overdoing the Nordics, what does that then do to the whole recruitment process, to the point of now when they're out there and they're being asked to just go do their thing, or they're being asked to sprint or whatever, like what kind of coordination process is potentially interrupted by the fact that we just told the body to be so slow force driven in that muscle that now the hamstring is firing in a weird way that doesn't have more of that natural like hip to thigh to foot sort of relationship, right? And so it's like you talk about in speed strength about, this, if you go heavy too much all the time in strength training, like you're basically teaching the body to be slow force generating And so now I'm going to basically adapt to stay on the ground longer because that's what I've told my body to do. It's like rely on impulse. It is not like rate of force development now. It's more of like if it's force times time, I'm going to spend more time to get more force kind of thing. Right.
Yeah.
So I always think about it as we have this big responsibility to these players, because if I over intervene with my training and I don't respect the neurological processes or the nervous system or everything, right? Their physical constraints, psychological constraints, technical, tactical, all of these areas. If I don't think about all these different areas, then I could potentially over intervene. And now when I put them out there, their body's not functioning the way it needs to function anymore. And so there could be some recruitment based issues, or, if maybe they are doing a task based thing where their focus of attention now is on the task instead of how they're moving, as it should be. Right. But because of what my intervention did, I've like fatigued this one particular muscle group so much that even when they're chasing this guy down, they still pull a hamstring, or it's complicated. Like there's so much that goes into that. Right. But I think that's stuff that we need to think about is like, are we potentially over intervening with what we do? And I think that's my boss here, Dom Sadzinski. He does a really, really good job whenever we're in season of keeping football the main thing. Like football is we got to get them to the fight. We got to get them there. We got to get them feeling really good. We're still going to train. We're still going to try and develop. But like, I need to watch practice. I need to take notes. I need to bring that back so that I know how to design my training intervention so that I'm not interfering with what they just did out there. So let's say I take my lineman group and I don't watch practice, and they're out there the whole time smashing the sled with their pressing muscles. They're smashing each other with their pressing muscles. The whole time they're just press. Right. And then I'm like, I'm gonna bring you guys in tomorrow. We're gonna do a bench press session. We're gonna do 5 sets of 5. We're gonna do 3 sets of 10 flat bench. So I'm gonna do 3 sets of 10 incline bench and maybe some decline push-ups at the end, right? Like all this pressing. It's like they just did so much of that. So am I over intervening? Like, yeah, okay, a lineman needs to be strong in his pressing muscles, but he just did all that stuff yesterday. I don't need to do all this stuff today. Right. And if anything, I might have to offset it. Maybe we have a full pulling session, or I don't know, just whatever you decide it's going to be. But that's where I think that we always have to keep the main thing the main thing. That was a lesson I learned from Fergus Connolly when I worked on him with the book series. Is just, if we don't do that, if we don't understand things in context, or even try to understand things in context, then we're probably doing more harm than good, or we're doing a disservice. And it's like I said, going back to the Nordics thing, like if we overdo the Nordics, are we actually, with the intention of protecting the hamstring, are we now actually potentially destroying the hamstring because we're overworking it and it can't operate the way it needs to in the sprinting specific pattern? So it's interesting stuff to think about.
Yeah, I love that it fits with like the balance point of all things. And I know I did want to get into like more of the lifting because we have just a little bit left, and like overlifting, strength training across university season or year to year, and progression. And it is interesting too with like the Nordics. I'd be curious of like what the threshold is for overdoing Nordics. As a track strength coach, actually, I had really positive experiences with that. Like Keith Barr, it's like local slow strength, right? And you think about, well, like a squat's a little bit different because it's like bigger, compressive, more joints. There's more room for shape change. Like I think about like Adam Archuleta's training, and Jake Schuster had mentioned data points like with Nordics being, and I know there's a debate with it. I think if you did 10 sets of 10, that would definitely be bad. Like 2 sets of 5, like 4, what's I'd be curious of who is getting that point with a Nordic, and that's probably its own conversation. But obviously, like with squats and what we'll be talking about, like big lifts, big compressive lifts, and especially with skill players, there is that point in the balance of the whole system where, yes, we can be causing some substantial issues. So if you had any thoughts on your own experience with Nordics, I'd love to hear that. But I also wanted to ask you about what do you do with strength as well, like strength year to year, skills, bigs. What's your key performance indicators? How does this fit with F0? This is like, I know we only have like 10 minutes left, so it's like, well, here's another half-hour conversation. But yeah, anywhere you wanted to jump in there, I'd be really interested with what you have.
Yeah, it's interesting because I'm at a point now where I'm an assistant strength coach. So I work for Dom, my head guy here. And so a lot of it's a combination of all of our thoughts that come together. And so, but part of working with him, and I love that he puts this upon me, is that he's always asking me to question everything, and so from the specific standpoint of the skill players, we'll just say that. I won't even talk about the linemen or anything like that, but from the standpoint of the skill players, kind of going back to the type of guys that we're getting in, right? These longer, lankier, elastic, greyhound type of guys that we got guys that come in that are 5'10" playing cornerback, and everybody's like, oh, he's too short. He needs to be 6'2". He needs to be 6'3". Like, I would love to get this long, lanky guy at safety. And so we want more length, right? And so it's just, to me, I started thinking about, like, all right, if we're recruiting these bodies that look a little bit more like sprinters in terms of, their torso to limb ratio and all of these things, then what is it that I'm a big believer in the fact that there's architecture, underlying muscle or just tissue architecture that makes the person do what they do. I mean, like, there's potential there. Obviously, there's the software and the hardware. Like, I need to still be able to recruit my structures in order to get them to fire properly. But I still think that a lot of the discussions in some of the Bosch books about muscle architecture is fascinating to me. I think a lot of people they don't like him, and he's a controversial figure. But to me, there's some stuff there. Right? What's that?
The pennation stuff, right? Like the leverage and the pennation angle change.
Yeah, but like to a certain extent, like your structure, like your ability to do something, the structure's got to have something to do with it. You know what I mean? And so, like in the world of physics, like how is it that a grasshopper can jump the equivalent of us jumping on the top of the Empire State Building? You know what I mean? Like, it's just like relatively speaking, it's the way that thing is designed, like the structure of its architecture. So it's very interesting to me, all of that stuff, and I'd love to learn more about it. But you talk about like fascicle length with the hamstrings and all of that, and how do we improve that, or what leads to better adaptations there? And now there's this whole argument about, is it eccentric during the swing phase, or is it isometric on the ground cut? Like, it's just hilarious because we don't know. Like, we assume we know things that we don't really know, or that we just need to research more. And so it's all fascinating to me because it all just helps us understand things. And so going back to the Nordics, I mean, I don't have a specific example of where I think we overdid Nordics. It's more of I just use it as an example of, can we potentially over fatigue the hamstring, and how does that then affect the neural recruitment pattern and all of that? But tying all of that into the actual strength training is that when I look at track and field and a lot of literature from there, the weights that they're utilizing, it's mostly just submax, and it's really interesting to me where it's really all below 90%, or at most maybe 90%. Like, it's very rare that guys are, like, a lot of these really good coaches are utilizing long phases of really straining through some weight, you know what I mean? And just like grinding through it, like what we typically see in college football. And so when it comes to these athletes that are long, lanky greyhounds, and they got to be really elastic, really reactive, and really fast, the thing that seems to keep coming up over and over again is like long durations of heavy lifting are, Bush Exnator calls them, like, they call it discoordination.
Yeah.
They affect elasticity. They ruin it, essentially, if you do it for too long. And so he's like very specific about how he uses his heavy lifting for activation.
Yeah.
And so, and he knows that during those phases that he's actually doing that, he's not expecting his athletes to perform at their best, because it's just this phase where, like, he wants to get the hormonal changes that occur from it, maybe some of the neural recruitment changes that occur from these high force movements, and then he gets out of it. And what's really interesting to me about him is he's described in the past how he'll do, like, phase one is not a strength phase. Phase one is a power phase. And so he'll do a power phase where he's keeping his Olympic lifts like 60 to 65% and doing reps of like 4 or something like that. Or he's keeping his squats and his presses less than 70% 1 RM. Like, it's just light, move it well, do it fast. But at the same time, we're doing some multi-jump work, and we're priming the system with this sense of power and explosiveness. And then he moves into a strength phase after that, where he feels like the neural recruitment he gained from just activating the system through power, now he doesn't have to squat heavy for as long because the system is primed now to be activated. So he gets actually more activation into his strength lifts. And then once he gets what he feels like it's enough there, he moves on and goes right back to power. It's kind of like, to bring up Derek Hansen again, how he had that article a while back of, like, we feel like we need this huge base of strength with everybody, but, like, what about a base of speed?
Yeah.
Why not? Or a base of power? I think we're so comfortable in this world of lifting more weight, add more weight to it. Like, lifting heavier makes you better kind of thing, or just like add more load to it. And the correlation with, there's, all these papers that are talking about correlation with sprinting and all of that. Right. But it's at a certain point, I'm like, well, I need to listen to some of these guys. Like the people who train the fastest people in the world probably have an idea of how to get people faster, more so than any lab coach or college football coach or whoever it might be. And so the more I just think about excessively lifting heavy all the time and what that does to the nervous system, and how your book was great about it. I thought the way that you wrote about it and speed strength was fascinating, and it probably pissed a lot of people off in my field. But to me, I'm like, I just, there's something there, like we talk about Ben Johnson versus Carl Lewis. Like that's the one that always comes up, that people in my field love that. They love Charlie Francis. They love all this stuff. And they talk about, man, Ben Johnson squatted 600 pounds and benched 400 pounds or whatever it was, whatever the numbers were. And like, look how fast he was, broke the world record. And like, Carl just did like plyometrics and didn't lift. And nobody's asking like how that dude was just about as fast as Ben Johnson without even lifting. You know what I mean? Like it's something that we got to ask ourselves. Like, instead of ignoring that, we need to be like, how is that even possible? Like, how did he do that? So I've had some really interesting conversations with Stu McMillan recently about just fascia and just developing the fascial system and what does that look like. And when you think about fascia and how it's like this interwoven tissue around everything, and it's so neurally important, if the fascial system is operating at a high level, it's this force amplifier, right? It's almost like this superpower if it's properly utilized. Because when I played college football, I remember like I was a big weight room guy. That's why I'm a strength coach, right? I'd be out here trying to squat heavy, squat deep, all of this stuff, chase higher and higher lows. And I got and I played safety. So I have my teammate next to me at the next rack. I'm over here trying to squat 400 to 500 pounds and crush it. He's got like 275 on the bar, right? And he's struggling with it, right? He's not moving it very well. And then we get out on the field and I go try to smack our tight end and I bounce right off the dude. And this guy comes in and smokes him. You know what I mean? Like, it's just like, what is that about? Like, how did he do? So force amplifier, power amplifier, like he's probably more fascially developed than I was. And he was a longer, lankier guy, right? More elastic natured kind of guy. So he couldn't like grind through weight very well, but he could smack somebody on the field. So I'm like, how is that possible? You know what I mean? So I've just been diving down this rabbit hole of like, what does all this mean? Like, so it's really blown my mind in terms of what we mean by strength again, right? It's always like what JB Marin says, like what force at what speed? Like, what is it that I need to be able to do? Is it more of am I super strong isometrically? Am I strong eccentrically, concentrically, And I had a really good conversation one time with Ryan Grubbs at the Texans, and he talked about the obsession with concentric strength. Like, it's just so easy to measure. It's so easy to see. And we're just obsessed with it. And he's like, but there's other low hanging fruits out there that we're not paying as much attention to, like rate of eccentric force development, or, my isometric force capabilities, or my horizontal power. It's just, everything is like, how much do you lift? And so when I think about maximizing the nervous system and improving the fascial system, my thoughts about it all change. Where is it now more about, the weight room for every track coach, like Charlie Francis included, who lifted heavy with guys, it's an activator. Mm-hmm. It's something that potentiates. It's not like the be all end all thing that makes somebody better, And even when I think about muscle hypertrophy, it's interesting too, because some people are like, well, you got to lift heavy to put on muscle and do all these things. And again, like you look at the broad scope of research, and I think it was Andrew Huberman on that same podcast that talked about it, where he's like, you could go between 30% and 80% and have pretty significant strength and muscle size. And, obviously if you have a lower percentage, you got to do more reps or lift with more intent or whatever. Like there's layers to it, but it's like, okay, so I don't have to just grind through 100% of my max all the time to get strong or put on muscle or any of that. And so recently I had a player here that was training who was in the NFL. He played at Auburn. He came back and trained. He started somewhere around January. So we had like 10 to 12 weeks together, and he wanted to put muscle on, but I tried to test this stuff out where like, I didn't really lift him any slower than like 0.5 meters per second on any main lift, which if that's a squat, that's like somewhere around 90%. So everything was at most 90%, but it was like, we really lived in sort of that 70 to 80% range, but everything was high intent, velocity based work, right? We're doing a lot of explosive work around it. We're doing sprints, all this stuff. And he wanted to put some size on. And when he went back to his team, he texted me yesterday actually, and he said, they just retested me from January and I put on, what do you say? I lost 10 pounds of fat mass and I put on 8 pounds of lean body. You know what I mean? So it's like, so we didn't like really lift heavy at any given point, well, we just trained hard, we trained well, and he put on a ton of muscle and lost some good fat. And so it's just one of those things where like, okay, so we don't have to just grind through weight to put on muscle either. So it's just, again, I think it's just more about, even from the standpoint of hypertrophy, right? If I'm more neurally integrated to my lat, if I'm doing like a one arm row, and I have better neural integration to my lat muscle and I can activate it more, it's going to grow faster than if I'm just like throwing this dumbbell around and I'm using every muscle fiber. Now I'm not even recruiting just my lats. I'm recruiting everything. I'm all the way down to my freaking calves and everything. Right. So it's just, I think the way that we need to think about strength training, it's just like, we just have to question some of the stuff we're doing. And I'm not poo-pooing heavy strength training or anything like that. I think it's exactly what a lot of these guys are saying is like, it's an activator. It's something that's used to amplify this or that. But then there's all these other things that are actually driving the adaptations that we want, more so than just lift heavier, lift more, lift. So it's very fascinating to me.
Yeah, one of the things, I just think that there's so many, like human performance is complex. And as I've been I'm trying to round out my own library a little bit with like a lot of the stuff. You mentioned Werner Gunther, like Jean-Pierre Egger's work, Giles Cometti, or I guess in French it's Cometti. And Jean-Pierre Egger, I sent him an email and he told me, he's like, back in the 80s, we had better like connection with the sports science that was being done. And it's interesting because I think a lot of the really good like muscle physiology, if you look at the 80s, just kind of coming off the tail end or even intermixed with like the Soviet machine, there was a lot of really good physiology, muscle physiology, a lot of good jump research and all that stuff. And it was getting tied right in. And in Cometti's work, it's one of the things I think was so, like, I don't see this now, but I saw it in the 80s in his books, is each like type of stimulus, be it eccentric, isometric, normal, electrostim, plyometrics. It's like, okay, here's what this does for you. And then here is the drawbacks. But that's the thing is now we don't really talk about, and we don't talk about the drawbacks. It's all, well, what does it do? And then in a way, it can become just more and more and more. You just have everything in there, right? Like I have all the stuff. But yeah, as to what you were talking about before, like if it's efficiency, it's I look at almost like acupuncture, like some of these things that are true, like ancient arts, you could say. Like what's a good acupuncturist? They know the one like place, they know the one node to put the needle versus like someone who's not as experienced. Well, let's put like 10 needles and let's hope that works. And that's where experience comes in. So I think I just think, yeah, the thing that's so interesting from back then was that work that sprang out of being intermixed with the muscle research, the neural research, and saying, okay, we see this for this time period of benefit. We see this negative. And then you become experienced and you know how it mixes together. But I think where it comes down to for us in the modern age is knowing that, but it's also like being efficient with it. Like even I think about like 1x20, very efficient. But I was just having this conversation recently, but like a 1x20, if we talk complex training, it's kind of complex training in one set. Your first few reps, 5 reps might be faster, more explosive. Then the next 10 might be more strength, typical strength. They're going to get slower, you're starting to get tired. And then the last 5 are almost like a little bit of a mini burnout. So you get like these different experiences in one set. And it's in its way, in its own way, it's high efficiency. So I think with so many things athletes have to do, like you said, like I should just get strong and then I should just be able to go crush it on the field. Like the least amount of extra stuff to juggle around. So I think that's the trick as well. But yeah, it's certainly a complex area, and it's definitely easier to waste time and do too much in the weight room, I think, than to do the right amount, especially given longevity in an athlete's career and the key performance indicators that they need to hit specifically for their position.
Yeah, I think what was great about a lot of the stuff in your book was that you're talking about how the whole thing is a training system, right? So it's like, I think everybody just thinks of training as lifting, but it's a training system. So everything is an exercise to develop something, right? And so going back to Nordics again, not to bring it up again, but it's like one of these things where
it's a hot topic. It's it's a big thing.
Well, like how the Jordan team and JB and all them, they had the paper where they talked about how you can get very similar adaptations to Nordics just from sprinting. If you sprint efficiently and you sprint well, right? So you talk about sprinting versus an isolated muscle activity, you get the same adaptation. And so I think there's
a lot of something that we need to think about is what are we already accomplishing down the line? So if I have a whole sprint session, we do a lot of power work out there. I'm on the field and I'm sprinting, I'm doing acceleration work, I'm doing resistance sprinting, I'm throwing med balls, doing jump circuits. Let's say we do all that stuff. And now I get in the weight room and I'm doing like squats, I'm doing more jumps, I'm doing this, well, how much like of my legs did I already stress with all the field work, and how much more of it do I really need to do in the weight room? So it's understanding the totality of all of these things and how it's not only centrally affecting us from a nervous system standpoint, but also locally from the local muscular standpoint. Like, what is it that we need to better understand the adaptations to things like sprinting? What are the hormonal effects of that? What are the local muscular effects of that? Because I think we just think of it as like that sprinting, that speed, like my legs just didn't do anything. And then I go in the weight room and like, now I do my legs. You know what I'm saying? So I think it's like, if we do this whole big field session with our skill guys, like maybe the weight room is like 3 exercises, 4 exercises. Or you just hit your primary drivers and you get out, which is like a lot. Anytime I go visit Altus, that's what it is. They do this whole track workout and then they say, hey, come watch the weight room session. It's like 4 exercises, it's just enough to get a little bit of the extra stuff that they feel like they need. And then they move on. So it's all fascinating stuff to me.
Yeah. I think for athletes, especially you could say that the elastics too, I think it's true for all, but there's also like, it's almost like, well, why even go in the gym in some respects if you had a really stimulating speed or track session? And then I think the weight room can also be more of the connective tissue piece. And like, this is where the Keith Bar is like, hey, do some slow stuff to round out the connective tissue health, like with the Nordic piece or things like that. And I remember I've had conversations with like, you talk about year to year to year, like Olympic swimmers. And I've had conversations where and this is where it mixes with the head coach, what they want, and it's like, I have only so much control, but I've told athletes, hey, instead of the typical, just because, I don't know, for some reason, it's like, hey, we have a 7-day week and Monday, Wednesday, Friday, that's a good day to be in the gym. It just kind of works out though. But I've told people like, hey, you should be in the gym twice a week for 20 minutes. Like, you don't need any more than that. You have checked off all the key performance indicators. And I mean, even just from personal experience, and I heard Rafe Kelly talking about this too, like elastic, more air type people, like I've had great success with 1 set of 10, like once, maybe twice a week. Like that, if you are doing really, really stimulating stuff, 1 set of 10 can go a really long way. I mean, you'd be surprised. So yeah, I think it's, to look at the stimulus of the field. And that's where I do think we've had like I don't know. I look at so many things as you could say silo is the trendy term, but like there's a lot of separation in the way that if you could, on one end, you have this perfect world where there's whatever the job does break down to, whether it's a strength coach and sport coach, or maybe it's where the skill coach, if it's like track and the skill coach is doing the weights or whatever iteration, or you have a high performance manager overseeing sport coaches doing. I just think that in a world where there's different positions, the potential for inefficiency rises. And I don't think for some reason, that's never really brought up that much, especially in the interplay between strength and speed. And that's one of the questions I had you. Probably the last one I think we have time for here is because you wrote that book with Fergus. It was awesome. You guys were on the show. And yeah, do you have any thoughts on like the future where that heads, especially with, how easy it is to waste time doing other things and how we measure this all together? Any thoughts on, maybe this is a little idealistic, but we're going forward. How can we improve? How can the interchange be maximized?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it's an ongoing problem that needs an ongoing solution. I think it's, to me, I don't think the secret lies in any GPS technology or, measuring on a force frame or doing some type of vertical jump on a jump mat. I think the future in terms of some of this more performance science, and this is where Fergus has been huge for me, is he talks about the difference between performance science and sports science. Now, sports science is like, just collect data, compile data, make change based on the data and all that. It's like where performance science is now integrating everything and understanding the context of everything. And so a lot of it, I think the biggest performance indicator of your entire system is going to be communication. And that sounds really just cliche.
Yeah, I'd say the same thing.
But it's so true. I mean, it's just, if your communication with your coaches is not there, then you're not going to have a great system. I mean, it's just the way it is. It doesn't matter how good of a program you think you have in terms of your silo, like you talked about before. So my physical performance program could be, I mean, I could present it at a PhD seminar and everybody's like, man, they want to give me a Nobel Prize. But if I don't with my coaching staff to integrate, synthesize it with the sport and the practice of the sport, then it's all just for nothing. So we're blessed here that Dom, our head guy, and Coach Freeze, our head coach, we are blessed that they have they just have such an aligned relationship with each other. They trust each other. They communicate with each other. So when you have trust, now you have the opportunity to really get some cool things done. And like I said, Dom does a better job than almost anybody I've been around of keeping the main thing the main thing. So he's meeting with coach, he's meeting with the other coaches, and he's watching practice, and he's helping design the practice. And he's also not this kind of guy driven guys that are like, we can't do this, we need to do this. It's a give and take relationship. It's like you're never going to get the perfect system that you think is important, and because they're going to think something else is perfect. And so where can we meet together where we give and take, and it's better than what we did before as we go forward, And so like if we come to our coaches and we'd say, hey, Tuesday's practice load was 140% of what a game load would be. It's just something to consider. Mm-hmm. Sometimes they just don't even know. And at which point they're like, oh, okay, wow, yeah, we probably need to at least divide the reps up or scale them. And like, there's no reason we need to be playing a game on Tuesday when we have a game on Saturday, right? So, there's just all these different aspects of communication and understanding where everybody's coming from and getting terms defined properly. So if a coach says he wants more speed, what does he mean by speed versus what do we mean by speed?
Yeah.
It's all stuff that I learned through that project with Fergus. And it really is everything. Like if you don't have that trust, if you don't have that, throw everything else out the window, because you can just do your best to hang on and hope something sticks, but you won't actually know you're making any change until you have that true organization wide network of communication where everybody's talking to each other. And here this is the place where I've seen that work the best.
Yeah.
And so I'm in a position where I'm like, we're gonna make some change. I can see a plan in place. Like things are gonna get better. We're gonna get better players in here. We're gonna be able to develop them in a better way. We're able to talk with the coaches about what we're doing, so we can get them to buy into what we're doing. And so it goes both ways. I think it's the strength coach or whoever really needing to be willing to go talk to sport coaches, and they need to be willing to listen, and vice versa. We need to listen to them because they got some pretty good insight. Like they actually understand a lot more than they get credit when it comes to all this stuff.
Yeah.
So. And they're getting more and more interested in it, I think, because they're doing it so much more at a pro level. And there's this whole thing about like just taking care of players, pushing them just enough, and getting them on the edge of chaos, and then just really trying to help them out and let the main thing be the main thing, like I said before. And it's cool, part of it. And I think that sport coaches deserve a lot of credit too, at least the ones that are willing to have these conversations. And it seems like there's more and more of them that are starting to pop up and realize that they need to have these conversations. And so, they're paying these strength coaches all this money. They might as well like trust them and talk to them and see what they're doing. So that's kind of my thought of it. I don't have a great answer for it, but it's I've seen it when there's not communication and there's no alignment, and I've seen it where there is, and that's the true, like the biggest performance indicator for me in terms of how well the team is going to do.
Yeah, I mean, it just makes perfect sense, and I think that is a great answer, because I think it's in one end you could give like, oh well, here's the high performance managers like framework, and it's like, well, at the core of it, just like the core of the athlete being basically the function of the nervous system, removing fear rate limiters, perceiving and reacting in your environment, the core of a team is how we communicate. And it is funny, it is cliche to say, but it's so true. And I think that maybe that's the next art form of that inner connection, is also communication styles and the way that ideas can resonate throughout the department. So, there's so much stuff in this podcast, front to back, Cameron, that was so good. I really appreciate your time. If I didn't fill up my note page in the first 10 minutes, I probably would have had 2 others. So thank you so much for your time. It was great chatting with you again as well. So I appreciate you being on the show.
Thank you, Joel. I always appreciate it. This was
Thanks for tuning in to another episode. I'll see you next week.